Public Relations. Edward L. Bernays. 1945. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Part 2. Public Relations in Action. 24. A different kind of poll preview of American public opinion. Most polls try to project into the future what people think or say they think. In 1944, during the war, I attempted to develop a poll that would analyze what people are likely to think and do about probable major issues in the immediate future. To that extent, it represented an original departure in opinion polls. The results of this survey were published in the American Mercury for March, 1944. Time confirmed the validity of this poll. In working out the poll, I first made up a list of the important groupings that I felt played a part in the final determination of United States policy. I included in this list groups representing all the major cleavages of the United States: farm, labor, industry, ethnic, religious, and so on. I asked the leaders of each group what they felt were the probable major issues and what they would do about them. Then I tried to interpret what they said by evaluating the conflict or adjustment of the various forces in action. This chapter is based on my Mercury article. In 1944, while the United States was still fighting World War II, there were widespread fears voiced in editorials, radio comment, and political speeches that the American people might be so divided in the immediate future as to threaten the very foundations of our democratic society. The public had these misgivings as it saw strikes, racial clashes, political quarrels, and other seeming evidences of disunity. Nevertheless, on the basis of a careful and new type of opinion survey, I felt justified in asserting that the gloomy prophecies were unjustified. On the evidence gathered, I ventured to forecast that the immediate future would find us a strongly united people. Opinion polls ordinarily attempt to measure existing attitudes on public questions. By comparing these attitudes with past attitudes, they seek to trace trends in mass opinion and mass preference. The survey I conducted, however, broke away from this procedure. Geared to opinion on the immediate future, it did not pose specific questions and it did not probe the public as a whole. Instead, it sought to determine 1. What would be likely to emerge as the chief issues of popular interest in the near future, and 2. What would be the prevailing view and action on each of these subjects. That survey, an original attempt to estimate public opinion and action in the next 6 months or so, indicated clearly that, as a nation, we would agree on what were the main issues facing the country, and be almost unanimous in the determination to solve them along democratic lines. I base the survey on a principle that I have tested thoroughly in the course of more than 25 years in the field of public opinion. Its validity is today generally accepted. I refer to the principle that the opinions held by group leaders in a democratic nation today become the mass opinion tomorrow. If we can ascertain what those who mold public opinion believe now, we have a reliable preview of what public opinion and action will be later. Obviously, no one group of opinion makers, regardless of how influential it may be, provides an adequate guide to future general public opinion, but a representative sampling of all groups of opinion makers does provide it. Thus, where other polls test the attitudes of a cross-section of the whole population, I addressed myself only to a cross-section of group leaders. My poll covered an ample segment of all the men and women who shape public thought and action in our country, editors and commentators who reach millions of minds, labor leaders, public officials, educators, publishers, outstanding business executives, writers, economists, physicians, ministers, and heads of organizations of every type. I gave them complete freedom in selecting the issues they believed would be dominant in the next 6 months, in stating their views on these issues, and in indicating what action they expected to take to make their views prevail among those whom they influenced. The responses were gratifyingly full and frank. They represented every section of the country and every type of opinion. The survey disclosed what would be the 5 major issues in the public mind for the months ahead, and what would be the prevalent public opinion on these issues. The 5 main issues, in the order of their importance, were: winning the war, the cost of living, international cooperation, race relations, and labor relations. 3 additional subjects, also in order of their importance, were the 1944 elections, the trend of the federal government, and demobilization. It was hardly necessary to elaborate upon the first 2 issues. Everybody would want the war won as quickly as possible. The people would want to follow the commander-in-chief and his aides in whatever they thought best to bring the conflict to a speedy and victorious conclusion. Everybody, naturally, would desire to have the cost of living reduced, with profiteers curbed and punished. But we could expect a divergence of opinion on how the cost of living should be kept down and inflation combated. A large sector of the public would favor wage controls and price controls, and would put up with rationing to the limit. On taxation there would be the usual cleavage of opinion. But even in the field of taxation and finance I felt safe in forecasting unanimity of resolution to make all sacrifices decided upon. An industrial executive from Springfield, Massachusetts, was in effect offering a preview of future opinion when he wrote, "I will subscribe to the war loans to the limit and pay taxes with as cheerful a grin as I can muster." As for international cooperation, my survey revealed that in the near future some people would be worried about communism in America. Many would be critical of Britain's colonial policies and Russia's expansionist aims. The overwhelming majority would, however, be in favor of some international combination of nations for collective security. The American people in the coming months would also favor free trade, an international bank, an international police force, and a world court. On post-war boundary problems, citizens would insist that the United States play an important role, with a view to avoiding future international conflicts. In short, on the basis of what molders of opinion believed at that moment, I could predict that Americans in the months ahead would frown on extreme isolationism and would support a greater participation in international affairs. I predicted, as a corollary, that those who counted on a popular swing toward pre-war types of isolationism as a result of domestic discontents were deeply mistaken. As an indication of the pattern of the coming public opinion, I cited a typical statement by a prominent Iowa Republican editor who wrote me, "I will give no aid and comfort to any isolationist trend in my party. The party will be as dead as a dodo if any such attempt is made." This view was clearly dominant, though there would be a distinct minority view, as evidenced in a comment such as this from a businessman: "If you care for a prediction, next year will be a period of rapid ebb for internationalism in the United States, and a rapidly mounting tide of American nationalism. The reaction to the one world ballyhoo has already set in, and we may look for a return of old-fashioned patriotism." On the basis of my poll, I predicted that most Americans within 6 months would favor the middle road between old-fashioned patriotism and all-out internationalism. Race relations would loom large in the public mind in the immediate future, because it already occupied a prominent place in the thinking of those who shape public opinion, though few permanent solutions would be forthcoming. The prevailing opinion on this issue would be moderate, sympathetic, and democratic. Americans as a whole would demand more economic and political opportunities for the Negro and a genuine amelioration of his status. There would be mounting public antagonism to the Southern poll tax. The people as a whole would be appreciably less concerned with the Jewish question, though a small percentage would intensify their anti-Jewish talk. The texture of the emerging opinion could be judged by this typical response by a Middle Western newspaper editor: "More and more efforts on the part of race-conscious folks and Jew baiters to unload their ills on the Negroes, and Jews blame them for everything. It won't work. This country has a destiny and the undercurrent is for justice and right. We must have it, and the good people are determined to get it for every citizen." In the domain of labor relations, my poll indicated that many people would ask for legislation calling for greater responsibility of union leadership, the incorporation of unions, quick federal action on strikes and war plans, and the redrafting of the Wagner Act. We had a foretaste of public opinion in the following typical expression by a Washington, D.C. editor: "I hope that resentment among soldiers and civilians against unwise union tactics can be prevented from taking the form of a punitive attack on unorganized labor. Believe attitude of labor leaders in resisting moderate efforts to correct union abuses and require greater union responsibility, is contributing more to danger of such an attack than is the attitude of certain employers who hope for a union-busting era after the war." Another facet of coming opinion on labor was revealed in the typical view of an Indiana labor official discussing labor and post-war re-employment. He warned, "This question should be seriously considered now by the American people. After all wars, when men and women are unemployed, the employing class has nearly always, according to history, taken advantage of the labor market and has, very often, successfully destroyed the living conditions, wages, hours, etc., of the masses of the workers. We should now give serious thought to and make provisions not entirely dependent on the government, that the millions of men and women engaged in the war directly or indirectly, shall have an opportunity to earn a living." An Ohio radio director voiced the prevailing opinion, which favored amicable adjustment of the differences. "A vast public education campaign is necessary here to remove prejudices between labor and management based on ignorance, and to get areas of agreement out in the open." On the 1944 election, as was to be expected in a democracy, there were sharp differences of opinion. The big issue would be Roosevelt, and the tacit assumption seemed to be that he would run for a fourth term. Regarding the trend of the federal government, the people in the coming months would almost unanimously demand the strengthening of democratic defenses against attempts, direct and indirect, for centralized control. A Boston newspaper editor expressed a typical future opinion when he called for more than lip service to our Constitution and Bill of Rights and pointed to the imperative need to make these alive and keep them alive for every inhabitant of this land. I forecast that the American people will be solidly behind the principle of free enterprise. The majority of the people would not insist on the quick demobilization of our troops. This was evident in leader opinions, of which the following from a New Jersey editor was representative: the government should resist the clamor to bring the boys home, in order to prosecute the Japanese war intensively, to maintain adequate military and naval garrisons throughout the world, and to make the demobilization of the millions in service very gradual. The country would probably come out more definitely for universal military training after the war and would insist that former servicemen be assisted in obtaining jobs and be given every educational opportunity to better their lot. They would also favor post-war planning mostly by state and local government rather than by the federal government. On all these 8 issues, the poll revealed, there would be no marked cleavages in the attitudes of various sections of the country. All sections would regard the 5 major and 3 additional subjects in very much the same order of importance. In the northeastern states, labor relations would occupy an importance almost equal to the cost of living and international cooperation, while in the southeastern states the trend of the federal government would assume more importance than in the rest of the country. In the north-central states, race relations, particularly the Negro problem, would hold greater interest than elsewhere, as would be the case in the Pacific Coast states, with the emphasis on the Japanese problem. But these variations would be minor. The survey disclosed a considerable difference among the professions. Educators, for instance, were most interested in the cost of living, with international cooperation running a close second. Writers and lecturers were more concerned with race relations than with other issues. The same held true for radio commentators and radio program directors. Liberals and labor leaders placed their main emphasis on labor relations and racial problems. Public officials differed little in their thinking from the other groups. To most of them, international cooperation and the cost of living appeared to be the most potent issues. In this survey, however, we were concerned not with what such molders of opinion thought then, but with what the great public, to whom their views would spread, would think in the immediate future. The notable fact that emerged was that, despite variations in emphasis, group leaders were in agreement on what the issues would be and in their general attitude toward them. Most significant of all, they were virtually unanimous that we must use only democratic processes in solving our nation's problems. Less than 1% revealed the slightest inclination to adopt revolutionary means. All these returns enabled me to predict, for the next 6 months, a truly united country despite those manifestations of disunity that made headlines. Crackpots, agitators, and panicky individuals spoke only for a small and negligible minority. The silent, deep-running opinion of the preponderant majority would be almost unanimously devoted to winning the war and supporting democratic ways on politics and economics.